Hi everybody, it's Andy Phillips here, and as you can see, I've got Rich, John, and Embers again on the line, and we're going to be. This is Atheist in Conversation. We're going to be talking about. Yeah, we've got my cup of tea. Got my cup of tea ready.
Yes. John still can't drink tea. He is still COVIDified, so he's only managing to drink water at the moment. Hope everything's all right with you, John. Hope you're keeping well.
I'm on the mend. Thank you very much. Yes.
Good. That's what I like to hear. Today we're going to be talking about evidence, and I think Rich, I think this is probably going to be you starting this one off.
Yes. Okay. I mean, I've got a couple of stories which I will tell throughout this podcast, which would, I think, help frame this discussion. First one is I'm going to kick off with is a story from my time at university. Back in the mid 90s when I actually went, and one of my best friends at university at the time himself was a devout Christian, and we were having a discussion, and I said, look, I mean, I don't accept the concept of faith of believing something without evidence. I need evidence to believe something is real. I need evidence to believe that something is true. And he said, well, what do you expect from God? Do you expect him to come down to earth, tap you on the shoulder and say, hello, I'm God? And my response to that was, well, it would be a good start.
Yeah.
But he'd better have brought some ID with him. And it led to this whole conversation about what itself would be good evidence for such a thing, and I do really struggle with this because it depends on how they define their God. Often they define it so that evidence can't touch it. Well, in that case, what good is that concept in the first place? But when they start making claims, factual claims about the God, about the things that this God does, the thing, or stories around the scripture or the history, they then start claiming that there is evidence for this and that this evidence is real, which brings me to the next story, which actually started a couple of years ago before lockdown. I was on a coffee date, and the person I was having coffee with, she was talking about her church. Bit of a red flag there for me. And she said, well, we know it's true because we know that, the fires of heaven that struck down the town of Sodom was real because we've got the physical evidence for that actually happening. And I thought, well, that's interesting because if we did have evidence for that, I'm sure I would have heard about it. The day ended, and apart from obviously the occasional times when I see her at social events, that didn't go anywhere. But very recently, we had a response to one of our tweets from an apologist who pretty much said the same thing, that we know that God is real because we know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is real because we found Sodom, and we have found where the fires of heaven and the fires of God struck down the buildings and turned the rock into ash. And you can put your hands in the ash and physically feel that this thing is real. Plus, we also know that the Exodus definitely happened because we can go to the place at the Red Sea where Moses allegedly crossed the Red Sea and was being led by the pillar of fire. You can see the marks that were left in the rocks by the pillars of fire. This is real evidence. This is actual archaeological and geological evidence that these things are real. And of course I said, oh, well, that's nice. 5 minutes Google foo on some, should we say, slightly more reputable geological and historical websites went on to show that actually that material isn't ash. It is a form of powdered rock, but it's a natural geographical formation that's not even unique to the area. The marks that were left in the rocks, which he claimed were only able to have been done by a vortex of fire. Actually, again, another natural geological formation, not unique to the area. And basically, no, we have not found the city of Sodom or Gomorrah, and we've not found the place where the Red Sea was crossed. And this so-called evidence, which had been produced actually by the same biblical archaeologist, had been refuted numerous times over by respectable archaeologists and respectable geologists. So, in other words, I'm sorry, but that evidence that you've presented is absolute nonsense. And by the very fact that you have not bothered to check your evidence because of your own motivated reasoning to state that that evidence is actually real, has led you to become, I'm afraid, what I would describe as a dishonest actor.
See, this is the thing here is, what does evidence actually mean? What does the word actually mean to them? Because it doesn't...
anything that supports what I want to believe.
Yeah, but this is sort of my point, really. It's the when we talk about evidence for something, we naturally go to crime, I guess. We go to when we're talking about the word evidence, evidence is normally associated with trials and crime, and if you're watching a police program on the TV, they talk about evidence and what's the evidence of this happening and things like that. And I think that people misuse that word a lot. Evidence. Yeah. I mean, we talked earlier about what is truth and what is fiction. You can't really tell what's truth and lies anymore. If you tell the same lie again and again, it becomes true. Yeah. But it seems to me that it's this misconception of what the word evidence is, because again, when we've had talks with theists that or apologists, you say, well, how do you know that's true? And they say, well, it says it in Mark. It actually says in Mark that this happened. It's like, but that's just an old book.
Yeah,
it says that in Mark, and it's like their concept of what evidence, what is evidence, is.
And why do you believe what Mark has said is true?
Yeah,
when he contradicts.
We hear this time and time again till we're sick in the back teeth. You ask for evidence, there's none forthcoming, and you keep pushing it, and they just show you the Bible.
This is one of the reasons why we have to know the Bible better than they do. This is what pisses me off more than anything else.
Yeah.
I mean, the more I've done it since I've been more involved in atheist movements, I've read more of the Bible than I've ever had in my life.
Or you.
No, it's interesting. I love it. I love the Bible. I think all these ancient books are incredibly interesting as pieces of literature, and as sort of like pivot points in humanity. They're incredibly interesting. And there's parts of the Bible that are absolutely beautiful. There's parts of the Bible that are appalling. But this, at the end of the day, it's really interesting. It's like Homer's Iliad is interesting. Doesn't mean it's true. It just means it's interesting. It's from a literary point of view, things like this are very, very interesting. And I don't mind having to read the Bible because it's reminded me how good it is in some ways. How amazing it that people have actually written this down and actually over the years put it into canon and created a religion on the back of it. I mean, that's quite amazing for humanity.
I find the history of the Bible. No, I find the history of the Bible more interesting than the Bible itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the reasons. So it's like when we spoke to Jason. He's an author and he's a blogger, but he's basically an author, and he's really, really into finding out the actual history and aligning it with the Bible and what was actually true and what isn't, and that sort of thing. And it's been incredibly interesting talking to people like that.
Yeah.
But you can see is the more you actually read not just the Bible, but the history of the Bible. You know, you talk to scholars about this, and we've had, you know, me and John have had podcasts where we talk to people who are scholars in the Bible. It becomes even more interesting as a piece of literature. Because you start learning about the politics of the time and the reason why something was written a certain way, and it's incredibly interesting.
But when you then start examining it, you discover that it's actually not evidence.
Yeah. So lots of stuff that historically isn't true, and therefore, if that's not true, then the story makes no sense. And if the story makes no sense, then there's no point having it in the Bible to tell you something which they say is true, which now you can say actually never happened. You know,
and when these theists point to the Bible and say, "This is my evidence," what you're actually saying is, "No, that's not your evidence. That's where you get your claim from, because all your claim is just regurgitating what's in that book. What do you have that is independent of that book that supports what is in that book?"
Yes.
Well, isn't it exactly the same as being an evolutionary believer, or a believer in evolution, an evolutionist as they call it, or a Darwinist as they call it, and just taking on the Origin of Species, take that book and say, this is true, right? This is absolute truth. Everything else that's said about it is complete lies. Only what Darwin says in this book is true.
And we don't even say that
that's not true, because we know that lots of stuff that Darwin said has been disproven. He was on the right course, and he started this whole process up. And people have, you know, the whole evolutionary theory now has been built on the basis of what people like him put in place to begin with. But the book isn't true.
No. I mean, the book provided the initial framework, which he got right, but a lot of the detail wasn't quite true. He didn't. Whilst Mendeleev was actually alive at the same time and was a contemporary of Darwin, he didn't know about genetics, and he didn't know about how how genetic traits were passed on, but he knew that there was descent, modification, followed by further descent, and the beneficial modifications stuck around. He didn't know the mechanism for that. And, you know, it wasn't just Darwin. You know, you had people like Alfred Russel Wallace and people like Patrick Mayhew, which one of my criminologist friends would not forgive me if I didn't mention him in the same breath, who all had these ideas at around about the same time. But we don't hold their views as gospel. You know, we've developed, you know, we have the neo-Darwinian synthesis in the 1970s with the discovery of DNA, and then actually understanding the real base mechanism of how genetics actually works, the fusion of genetics with it. It's not because it's written in a book. You know, what is written in the book is the result of the experimentation and the observation that have taken place. The book is the claim, the evidence for it. You can find it in the book, but you find it in the papers, the original papers that were written by the scientists who conducted the observations in the first place. And theoretically, I know most people would not have the opportunity to do this, but theoretically, you could go into a lab and you could examine the same things and see it for yourself. Obviously, you're not going to do that because access to labs can be quite restrictive, and not everybody has the chance to do that. But it's totally different from saying it's written in the book, therefore I believe it. And
if I tell you I've got a cat and you say, where's the evidence? I can go and pick my cat up and put it in front of the video camera right now.
Yeah, but see, there's also, I mean, just from saying that though, Embers, if you said I've got a cat, knowing who you are and knowing that cats aren't that unusual, I don't really need that much evidence apart from what you said. Tell me, if you tell me you got a cat, I'll believe you got a cat. Why would you lie?
Yeah, but if you didn't know,
spacemen landed in my garden and they cooked me breakfast in the morning, then I'd want some bloody evidence on that.
Yeah, but if you said I really want to see your cat, I know you've got a cat, but I really want to see it, I can go and get it and put it in front of the camera. What I won't do is go and show you a book and say my cat wrote it. Big difference.
Yeah. And go John.
Getting back to your story, Rich, at the beginning when you said about Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yes.
That person there was a disconnect there, because that person was using the ruins of a building as evidence for a being.
Well, it wasn't even the ruins of a building. It was a deposit of particulate rock matter, which had the same general look, feel, and consistency of ash. And claiming that the biblical archaeologist that had discovered this so-called ash had said this is the ruins of a building. So it wasn't even the ruins of a building. It was
whichever. It's a non sequitur.
Yeah,
a pile of ash is evidence for a pile of ash. It's nothing to do with any agent or person you might imagine. And that reminds me of a conversation I've been having on Facebook about testimony. Because somebody came up and said, testimony contradicts itself sometimes. He said, what about this? There's a murderer who's got blood of the victim under his fingernails, but his phone record shows that he was moving about in his home at the time the murder was committed. And, well, his phone isn't him, Somebody else had his phone. They don't seem to make those sort of critical thoughts.
Yeah, and knowing the criminal justice system, having myself given evidence in court, it's about how reliable is what it is you are saying. So this comes to another point. Something can be evidence, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's good evidence.
Yes.
And it should. It should. And again, one of the biggest failings of the criminal justice system is the heavy reliance on eyewitness testimony, which is notoriously unreliable. And yet we keep being told there's all these eyewitnesses to certain events that happened which prove that a God exists. But when you actually start digging, no, they're just stories, they're claims. And when you actually start digging, some of the stories aren't quite as they revealed them to be. Some of them actually do have rational, naturalistic explanations. And I mean, the one that always got me was, of course we know Jesus ascended into heaven because we have 500 witnesses that saw it happen. I said, really? Name 3 of them.
Bring them to the witness box for cross-examination.
And it says in the Bible that there were 500 witnesses. Fantastic. Give me their names. Give me their contributions to the historical literature. Give me their statements that said, we saw this happen.
There's masses of modern research to show how unreliable eyewitness testimony is, which has to be treated with a big pinch of salt when you hear that in court. The problem with evidence from the religious apologist point of view is that if you ask for evidence, there's none forthcoming. They'll just say, I know, or point to the Bible, in which case, all atheists just roll their eyes to the ceiling. And then they'll come back with, prove he doesn't exist. And that's another eyes rolling to the ceiling. And then when you keep pressing it, this is when they start to shake because they can't continue the argument. They'll just say, well, God is unknowable and outside the physical universe. So,
and we've said. Yeah,
we've said get out clauses. It doesn't matter what you ask. Yeah. There's a get out clause.
And in the worst case scenario, which so many apologists do now, is they just make it up.
Yeah.
Because lying for Jesus is allowed.
Oh, it's not lying, Rich. It's interpretation, apparently.
Yeah. No. Oh. And
it's an earner.
But listen, this isn't that what rabbis have been doing for centuries?
Yeah.
Is they sit in little circles and they'll interpret what God actually meant, and that becomes more and more widespread and well known, and then that becomes what it actually means.
But
I've seen this time and time again.
Yeah. Why should something that comes down from a God need interpretation? Surely it would be clear. But again, going back to this concept of evidence, they either make stuff up, or they over or under interpret what's happening. So, for example, as I say, like this whole ash it's in the right sort of general location in the Middle East. It's sort of about the right age. It's sort of the right area. Oh, and it's ash. Oh, it must be Sodom. Yeah. When actually, no, it's a natural geological formation. It's a natural geological phenomenon. I mean, we see it all the time with every decade or so when they find Noah's Ark on top of a mountain. And when we look, no, it's a geological feature, and it's not even a rare geological feature at that. But because it fits the narrative on the surface, they will accept that as evidence.
Is there a serious question here? Do you think that they do this because they're desperate to prove it themselves? I mean, why would you go to all those lengths to try and discover the final resting place of Noah's Ark, for instance, and then say that that's what it is? And again, we're talking about evidence, but without any genuine archaeological or paleontological evidence. And what is the reason for doing that? Is that just to prove it to themselves or prove it to the world, or is it something which is necessary? Surely faith is good enough, isn't it? Surely.
But people want validation for their beliefs. It's a human trait. We all do it. In Christian groups, let's just talk about Christians a minute. Given that there are thousands and thousands of different denominations of Christianity in this present day, ask them all for evidence of God, and they'll probably all give you some different answer. But people need their beliefs to be validated for their psychological health. There's a huge amount of cognitive dissonance in this, where you can function in the real world. You could be a civil servant. High-ranking civil servant, for example, very, very skilled job, paid very well, been to university, and you can be a fundamental Christian. So you've got those two things struggling in your brain in your everyday life, and you just switch them off just like that.
There are a number of high-ranking scientists who do that. I mean, Francis Collins, fantastic example. Head of the Human Genome Project. One thing I will say about him is he doesn't deny evolution. He's actually a staunch evolution defender, but he is a very devout evangelical Christian who believes in the talking snake. He's actually said he believes in the talking snake, believes in those stories. And I'm thinking, but how do you do that? Isn't it called compartmentalization? I mean,
it's deciding to do it, deciding that this is my work. This is what I'm just going to work in this area, and I believe all the things in science and blah blah blah. But from a different perspective, I'm going to believe in this because I need to believe and have faith if I'm going to be a Christian.
The human brain has evolved
whether
to
it's
be
got
like
evidence or not.
It's an evolutionary thing with humans, and it's a survival mechanism. But with people believing, religious apologists believe in evidence, they tend to clump together. That's why they go to church and they have communities. So they're validating each other, so they can actually feel better about that.
It's mutual confirming of their own indoctrination. To go back to a previous podcast that we did very recently, they've been indoctrinated, but indoctrination can slip, and so they go along to these things to mutually support themselves. They don't do it consciously to do that. It's just what they do. And they get that validation and that sense of mutual support. And I think another key thing that you said, Mark, was that we all do it. Yeah, we're humans. We all do this, and we do it as well. But there's a big difference. One of the things that we have done, and it's one of the reasons why many of us do, is we've changed our minds about things. Many of us. I mean, I've changed my mind about numerous things over the years. There are some things that I'm probably not going to change my mind over. But at least theoretically, if I'm presented with evidence that I'm wrong about something, I'm going to check it out because I'm going to be highly skeptical of it. And if it turns out that I'm wrong, I have a tendency to admit when I'm wrong.
Okay, I mean, I've got a good example of this. You know, this concept of that. You know, if you're wrong about something and you're presented with the evidence that you will change your mind. You know, in a scenario, for instance, where in science we're beginning to understand more and more about the nature of the universe. You know, its beginnings or it's really difficult to say beginnings because it might not be the beginning. We don't know yet, but you know what I'm saying. Where we're beginning to understand a lot more about the nature of the universe and nature of you know, the substance of the universe. We're talking about things like dark matter. The reason why we call it dark matter is because we don't actually know what it is yet.
Because we can't see it.
There.
Yeah,
but
we know it's there because it's
dark.
Yeah,
so
but we know
at
it
some point we'll get to understand what that is. But the point of this is, if for some reason at some point in our future a scientist comes up with an experiment that shows that behind the Big Bang there is some sort of sentience, some sort of consciousness behind the Big Bang, right? If other scientists came in and said, do you know what that actually is? We've done this experiment. There actually seems to be some sort of consciousness behind the Big Bang. Okay, right. Of course, all the religious people are going to go, that's God, right? But all the scientists and people like us will go, that's really bloody interesting.
Yeah,
that's really interesting. Let's find out what it is.
Yeah, find out the nature of it. Yeah,
but that's the difference between people who want to know what the actual truth is. I'm not saying that there is a consciousness behind the Big Bang. What I'm saying is, if that was presented to us as a scientific concept, and it was starting to get backed up by other scientists, and they're going, actually, there is something here. We don't know what it quite is. We still wouldn't say it was God. But we wouldn't be going, oh, it can't be that, because otherwise we'd have been wrong all these years and God does exist. I wouldn't care a toss if I was wrong. And that's the biggest difference. I don't care. If you can show me something like that, then I want to learn more about that. You know, I still wouldn't call it God. It'd be a consciousness behind the Big Bang and what that consciousness is and how that works and can we communicate with it and all those sort of things. I'd be more than interested. I'd be more than happy to go down that road, you know. But that's the biggest difference. Evidence is about what is actually true. I want to know what's true. I don't want to know what is guessed or slipped in through supposition or presupposition. That is not evidence.
Or hypothetically, if that was ever to happen, and we're discovering more about the universe all the time, if you know we did hypothetically discover something along the lines you were talking about, Andy, obviously with the caveats that you said, it's not a God. It's definitely not going to be what's described in the biblical God. That's absolutely completely nothing to do.
Yeah, and it's not going to be something I'm going to go down on my knees and worship.
No.
Why would you worship? This is the whole point of it. With a scientific look, you know, an academic scientific look, you wouldn't be thinking, "Oh my God, it's God." You'd be going, "This is an entity. This is something out there. We've got to find out what it is. We've got to quantify it. We've got to put it in a box. We've got to understand it and label it, and we'd be working on this for the next, 500 years. It'd be fantastic. It'd be incredible to do. You know?
Yeah, atheists would just be going, "That's really interesting." I'll be watching the TV all the time, and
I'd want to learn more about this, and and that sort of thing. And but this is it. It's not God. It's something. We don't know what it is, and then we'll shape it, you know, and that's fine if that's the way that things work out. And this is just a thought experiment. It's not what's actually happening, you know.
No.
For anybody out there who's going, "Oh my God, I didn't know that."
there is.
It's like War of the Worlds, isn't it?
Yeah. There is one other aspect of this I also want to bring up, and that is this idea about personal anecdote and personal feelings being offered as evidence. Now, of course, it doesn't do anything for me because that's not something I've felt or experienced, or have I? Because I've spoken to people who have had what they call a personal experience of being in the presence of God, and all of. But that sounds to me just like chemicals flooding through the brain. It sounds to me like the first Madness concert I ever went to, where the support act was Ian Dury and the Blockheads, showing my age now a little bit, who came on, started playing the intro to Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick, and the crowd of 30,000 people, me included, pogoing in unison and bouncing along to that intro, and the overwhelming feeling of joy, that overwhelming feeling of that shared experience just swept over everybody in that crowd. Was that a religious experience? Did that happen? Well, it's an experience that we all had. It did happen, but I understand that was chemicals in the brain.
Yes, and it's a euphoric experience, and I mean I've had that. I mean I'd probably put it more towards Yes and Led Zeppelin and Genesis, but yeah, I've had those things. I mean, when I first saw Genesis, 1976, with all the lights and all that sort of thing, the sound, and it just blew my mind. Seriously, blew my mind. And I was.
Did you hear them getting back together?
I was floating, just literally floating.
The third coming.
So to me, right, that is an experience which, if I was in a church and I felt it, it would feel like the Spirit of God. You know.
Did you hear them getting back together? Genesis.
They apparently are getting together, but I doubt if I go and see them.
Is that the third coming? But anyway,
that's exactly what you've just touched on there. We've seen this again and again in large religious gatherings where you get the same crowd euphoria, and it's almost like people are smelling each other's pheromones and the atmosphere, and that creates chemical differences in your system. So you can feel euphoria, and exactly what happens in evangelical churches.
Well, I can give you another great example. I was at the launch. I was at the Texas Free Thought Convention in 2011. I remember this. It was in October 2011, and we were at the convention gala dinner, and it was the last public appearance of Christopher Hitchens, and he was brought into the room. Well, we'd eaten, and he was brought into the room. Richard Dawkins was presiding, taken up onto the stage, and Hitch gave his very, very last public appearance. And the feeling in the room was euphoric. Even though you could see the man was very, very ill, and in fact, obviously he died 2 months later, but you could see he was very, very ill, but you could still see the twinkle in his eyes. He was telling some of the same old jokes that we'd heard before, but we didn't care. He was frail, yet he got up, and once he started speaking, he kept going. And people were saying, because of his health, we don't expect him to be speaking for very long. And he gave a Christopher Hitchens talk. And he kept going. He kept going until the crowd was starting to think it's time to take a rest. But the feeling in that room was the same. It was euphoric.
Yeah.
The love, if you could say, the love that was felt in that room by 1,200 people in a single room with one of the giants of the movement. I know he would hate to be called that because he hated the very concept of heroes, but one of the heroes of the atheist movement at that time, who was clearly, this was going to be his last ever performance, but the euphoria was real, and this was in a room of atheists.
Yeah, the big difference is that we know Christopher Hitchens is real, did exist, and he's not there representing some other invisible entity. He's representing Christopher Hitchens.
Yeah.
Whereas the difference in big evangelical churches is that usually a very rich pastor who's conducting it all, claim to be a conduit from God.
But if that sort of euphoria had been generated in a church, which it could be by music, a good story.
I felt that in a church myself.
Yes. And
ironically,
it would have been interpreted as an actual visit or physical presence of God. And this is why we have wishful thinkianity.
Oh, I like that. Wishful thinkianity. I like that. Need a T-shirt with that on.
But that sort of thing has been sort of proven. That's the, these personal vibes that people get in church. I mean, if you actually look at the way the church service is actually conducted, especially evangelical church services
and Catholic ones,
specifically for that,
Yeah. This is the bit where you play the music. This is the bit where you get up and stand up and get them to sit down, and you're telling them to get up and sit down, and they're obeying you. And then you do this bit and to bring on the emotion, and you do this bit to also bring on emotion as you pass the plate round.
So, guys, the last word on this concept of evidence, what it should be and what it shouldn't be.
Check it,
Rich.
Check your evidence always. I mean, what I would say is to any apologist who happens to be listening to this, check your evidence. If you've got something that seems to support your position, double check it, and that actually counts to our side as well.
Sure. Yeah.
If you've got a piece of evidence that supports your position, check to make sure it is actually not false. And what I would say to the apologist, and I did say to the apologist who popped up on our Twitter feed, type in Sodom and Gomorrah found debunked. Type that into a Google search before you start presenting your particular favorite piece of evidence that seems to support your position. Check to see it hasn't been debunked first. And if it has been debunked, don't use it.
Yeah, and to apologists, if you're asked for evidence by an atheist, we'll probably just get bored after about 30 seconds, but don't show them the Bible, please.
Yeah. Actually provide us with something.
Yeah, and if you haven't got any evidence, don't make it up, because we'll see straight through you. If you don't know, just say you don't know. I believe just because I believe. We'll be happy with that. Don't make the evidence up.
Yeah, cool, excellent. All right, guys, I think that's about all we've got time for. We'll be here again next week because we're suckers for this sort of thing.
That's always a good excuse for another cup of tea.
Tea.
Yeah, absolutely. Always a good excuse for a cup of tea. If you want to subscribe to the channel, please do so. If you've got any queries, questions, or comments, just stick it below and we'll answer those. We want questions from everybody. So if you're a believer, we want questions. If you're an atheist, questions.
Oh,
if you're not,
he's freezing. He's freezing.
Questions.
Oh, technical difficulties.
It's going, I think.
Someone up there's not happy.
Am I?
The internet. The internet gods are angry. But so bearing in mind that, and I think Andy's connection is becoming very dodgy. So on his behalf, I hope he doesn't mind. Thank you for joining us. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, and we'll see you next time.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, thanks for joining us today, and don't forget to click that like button. Also, make a comment, and of course, subscribe to the channel. We'll see you next time.